Welcome everyone to this New Israel Fund Australia event with Anshel Pfeffer, senior correspondent for Haaretz and a columnist and contributor to The Economist and many other places. I happened to be in Heathrow Airport a few months ago, pick up the newspaper, and there's Anshel in The Telegraph. So you just amazing to say. Was it The Telegraph?
I think it's probably Sunday Times, but
the Sunday Times. Okay. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging that here we are in Melbourne, and I know we've got lots of people joining us at home on YouTube. We are here on the Bunurong land of the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that we are here on Aboriginal land where sovereignty has never been ceded. We come at a very interesting time in Israeli politics, and there's no one better than Anshel Pfeffer to help us digest and absorb it. Speaking to someone here just a few minutes ago, she said she struggles maybe to get excited and feels like things are very depressing in Israeli politics. We're going to try and lift people out of that, and even if we can't provide optimism,
what we're here for.
Though hopefully we can, at least we can provide a little bit of analysis maybe to the situation. So Israel's now about to enter its fifth election in just 4 years. Unprecedented in terms of Israeli democracy. I can't think of another country that has that paralysis. Belgium maybe has been through that, but not that regularity of elections. Certainly
Italy,
Italy. So it's
countries with good beer or good cheese.
Right, okay. Where's the good cheese in Israel?
No, so
Right.
Italy and Belgium.
Right, okay.
So we have what to aspire to.
Fair enough.
That's some good cheese in Israel. Too expensive though.
Maybe we can talk about socioeconomic factors in the election.
We should
I want us to
cheese.
start. Maybe Anshel can start. There's going to be plenty of time for questions. If you do have a question, you can type it in into the YouTube comments box. If you're watching on our website, you can click on the little YouTube button, and it'll take you to the website, and that's where you can ask your question. It'll come through here on my iPad, and people here will also be asking a couple of questions. Why don't you start, Anshel, by positioning us a little bit? There was an election. There was an election in March 21. There was a new government.
Yeah.
The government collapsed a couple of months ago.
The day after its anniversary. Yeah.
So what were the fundamental things that led maybe to this situation that we're here now?
So one of the words being used now in Israel to describe the government falling was the experiment that failed, and that was coined by the man who had basically caused the government to fail, Nir Orbach, a member of the now pretty non-existent party, which was the party of the Prime Minister until 2 months ago. And that kind of illustrates what's happened. The Prime Minister's party no longer exists. He's no longer the Prime Minister. His party no longer exists. It's broken up into lots of different warring. I mean, it was a small party to begin with. It only had 7 Knesset members to begin with, but Yamina, which is no longer, broke up, and one of its Knesset members, one of those who basically was on the brink of defecting, and that's why Bennett resigned, and they announced that the government's over, called this an experiment that failed. And specifically, he spoke about the participation of Ra'am in the government. There would not have been a government without Ra'am, because this government had the barest of majority, so every single party in it was essential. But Ra'am, as I'm sure you all know, United Arab List, the Islamist, they don't like being called Islamist, but they are an Islamist party, moderate Islamist or conservative Islam, lots of different words. But this was the first time that an independent Arab party had been part of a coalition in Israel. And there were many reasons why this government fell. It was 8 parties, so unwieldy, not just the first time an Arab party, but parties across the whole spectrum, from quite staunch nationalists, Yamina, Israel Beitenu, to Meretz on the left. It's a good question where Ram is. A Ram a right wing or a left wing? I always say that they're the Arab Haredi party, which they are. So you have all these different interests, all these different ideologies trying to coexist in what is not an easy situation anyway. Israeli politics coming under fire from a very well-oiled, very powerful political machine, which is the Netanyahu machine. And it's not necessarily Netanyahu himself, it's hundreds and thousands of proxies in the media, on social media. Many of the members, the right-wing members of this government, were live in communities where their neighbors, their friends, their relatives, people they go to shul with, people they associate on a daily basis. In some cases, even their spouses were dead against them joining, and were calling them really nasty names for being part of this government. So the fact that this government came into being and B, lasted for a year is not short of a miracle. When Nir Orbach used those words, the experiment had failed, he wanted to frame it as if it's the fault of Ram. And the fault, I think the blame goes to all parts of the coalition for what happened, because every party had its own issues and trouble being part of the collective responsibility. I don't like the term "an experiment which failed," and I wrote an editorial in Haaretz a couple of days after what Nir Orbach saying. We mustn't call this an experiment, because it shouldn't be seen as something experimental that an Arab party, Arabs are 2%, depends how you count, of Israeli population. So the fact that for 73 years Israel did not have Arab parties in any of the coalitions, that's the experiment that failed, and not the fact that finally we've had this. But this is certainly one of the reasons. This was a very difficult situation, a very difficult coalition to keep afloat. It, from the very beginning, it didn't really have a majority. One of the Ram members refused even to vote in favor. So because in Israel, the strange thing is that you can swear in a government without a full majority. It's enough to win the vote.
Right.
To kick them out, you need a full majority. So it was enough for the government to win 60-59. It was clear from day one that it wouldn't last for very long. It lasted for a year. It proved that such a government is possible, but it's a very difficult thing to keep afloat.
So I definitely want to talk about the cultural change in Israeli politics that occurred, whether there is any long-lasting impact to having an Arab party in the coalition. But I first want to come and talk back about the members of the coalition. It seemed like a very risky proposition for them all to enter. They all had a lot to gain by obviously showing they could be in government, particularly the parties of the left who hadn't been in government for such a long time. But there was a lot of risk. There was a lot of risk that they would be perceived maybe as, particularly for right-wing members, like you said, as traitors to their camp by joining with the left. The left felt like they had to compromise by waving through policies, particularly in the occupied territories, that they were certainly uncomfortable with. The prospect of Gabi Lusky and other Meretz members voting in favour of the continuation of West Bank regulations is something that...
And for the expansions of settlement.
Right. I don't think she could possibly have imagined, in the year before that. So... was it, from their perspective, did the gamble work out? Was there anyone for whom maybe it was particularly successful, maybe other than Bennett, who got to become the Prime Minister?
Look, when you talk about risk, there's a risk if you do something, there's a risk if you don't do something. And I'd say the overwhelming majority of the constituency, which still does vote for these left-wing parties, and it's shrunk, obviously, wouldn't, with the exception of, I think, of a small minority, would not have forgiven Meretz or Labour if they'd said, no, we're not going to join this government because of those things you've mentioned. No, the desire to get rid of Netanyahu, the desire to finally see him leaving and to have a government in which he's no longer the Prime Minister, he's no longer a member, was so great. And some would argue, and it's a valid argument, that this focus on getting rid of Bibi is in itself damaging to the left, because it kind of obscures all the other very important policies. But the fact is that this has become such a burning issue, such an overriding policy, that Meretz could not have afforded to anger its voters and we've seen the result, because Nitzan Horowitz, now the former Meretz leader, was blamed for bringing in one of the Knesset members who was one of the reasons, one of the direct reasons why the government fell when it did, Renée Zouabi, and basically he had handpicked her to sort of be the second Arab woman and second Arab MK on the list. He was blamed by that he dropped down the list of in the Meretz primaries 2 weeks ago. He dropped down to 6th spot, which probably means he won't be in the next Knesset.
I think there was a hope and a naive hope. We spoke a bit about this at Limud yesterday. A bit of a naive hope maybe that Netanyahu would not be prime minister anymore. He'd sail into the sunset. The corruption charges would overwhelm him. He would be gone. That obviously has not happened. What has he been up to in the last year and a bit? How has he managed to stay relevant, to continue to destabilise, to attempt to, and then ultimately I think successfully kind of end up destabilising the government? Where has Bibi been out of the spotlight? And as the person who has written the most extensive political biography of Netanyahu, what's his psyche been, do you think? How has he coped not being in Balfour Street, not being the Prime Minister?
Well, for a start, it was very difficult for him, and people close to him. I haven't spoken to Netanyahu for a while. He doesn't talk to me anymore. But
he liked the book, though, didn't he?
Let's say he said that he liked another book less.
I don't know what that means. Okay, yeah.
There were a number of books. He said, I didn't read that book. I did read this book. So,
right, okay.
That's more or less.
Okay.
That's what's filtered through to me. Not everybody in his circle liked the book. Some did. Anyway, we were here 3 years ago to talk about the book. We're now beyond that. The first few months were very, very difficult. People close to him who do talk to me were saying that there really was a feeling around him that he was in some kind of mild depression, lost. I mean, for so many years, any politician who's in that kind of a role of a prime minister or president, who you get up in the morning, you've got your briefings, you've got people coming in and out, and you've got a very full schedule, and so many things are happening around you, and you've got all this big staff, and you've got the entourage, you've got the security, and the moment it's gone, he still has bodyguards, he still has a staff, but nowhere near as big. He hasn't got leaders and foreign ministers and so on dropping in every day from around the world to see him. He doesn't get those briefings, and he had a very, very difficult time adjusting to that, and people were getting phone calls from him. And they realized that the call was going on and on and on because he hasn't got what to do. He needs to spend time. So if in the past, he would finish a call within seconds, suddenly he was talking with people on the phone for hours. He got a phone for the first time. Right, yeah. He never had a phone before. It was always an aide bringing him a phone. For the first time, he had his own smartphone, and he learned how to use it, and he was making calls. So that was already Bibi adjusting. But overall, from day one, he was fighting to get back. And we'll talk in a moment about the psyche, what you asked, but there is still a Netanyahu camp. That camp didn't evaporate, not within Likud. Likud remains a very loyal party, and the slightest talk of replacing him or mutiny is very quickly shut down. But also beyond that, in the Haredi parties, in the far right parties, which were not part of this coalition, he still had a sizable political camp. They don't yet see someone else leading them, representing them as prime minister. And he had this quite massive media and propaganda machine, which was weakened because Israelis, the newspaper that was basically a sort of campaign funding loophole of the late casino mogul Sheldon Adelson, is no longer a Netanyahu supporting paper. It's quite agnostic. I mean, it's still a very right-wing paper, but it's agnostic who's leader. But now he's got a television channel, Channel 14, and increasingly relying on social media. He has a whole propaganda machine working, and it didn't stop working it didn't miss a beat. The moment he was no longer prime minister, it was there to get him back. He was there to try and come back. He said as much. There was never any. I mean, there was a period in which he was discussing a plea bargain with the previous Attorney General. A lot of people are now saying it's a pity that wasn't signed, and that would have meant him being forced to take time out. Right. But he's still there, and as far as his psyche goes, yes, he's going to be 73 next month. That may seem old to some. For him, he doesn't feel old. He's fit. His dad lived to 102 and worked well into his 90s. He doesn't. He said a few days ago, this is not going to be his last term.
Right. He posted the most remarkable video to Twitter yesterday.
Well,
I
the
think,
jogging one.
where he's jogging down the Tayelet, I think it was, next on the beach,
Yeah.
and the video is of people shouting out to him, "Bibi, I love you," and the whole it's this.
Well, you won't see people shouting and cursing him, and there were those as well.
Right, okay, but it was just how many? The question that was posed on Twitter was how many leaders post videos of people shouting "I love you" as they run down. You know,
So it's not so rare.
as far as I thought
Some people would say it happens more in banana republics, but it does happen.
Right.
But the thing is, he's not a.
but that seems like
He is actually very. He spends a lot of time in the gym. Running is not so much his thing, but it looks better on a video. Yeah.
Let's come back to the Arab party's participation. So much of the talk in the lead up to the election, and Netanyahu was the one who primed the electorate for the inclusion of an Arab party, of Ram in particular. How much of that has filtered through into wider Israeli society, where on the eve of the coalition being formed, we saw the most violent demonstrations of the divisions between Jews and Arabs that had been seen for 2 decades in Israel, and then for the Arab Party to come into the coalition, I think part of the hope was that demonstrating that having an Arab political party share power in Israel was a good thing for Israeli democracy. Has that filtered through? Have we seen changes that make us think that it's not going to be a one-off, that the strangeness was the first 70-odd years of the state and not the last one?
Well, it's part. I mean, since Israeli society is so polarized right now and things are so toxic. Oh, sorry. On the one hand, the centrists, because left wing, we don't really have a left wing in Israel, but the centre left, we can call it that, and even the moderate right who were in the coalition, I mean, some of them, those who kind of broke cover and kind of went back to the Netanyahu camp, but with their exception, yes, for that roughly half of Israeli society, that precedent has been made, the taboo has been broken, and they're willing to contemplate it again. And not that very long ago, Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid were both adamantly against having an Arab party in the coalition. Now they're both in favor. So that has improved. I mean, I'm assuming if it's an NIF crowd here, then people are in favor of having that kind of a coalition. So it's good. It's good for Israeli democracy. Yeah. On the other hand, the other half of Israeli society, the backlash there has increased. And if there were some people within Likud and Netanyahu himself were kind of at least quietly considering doing that and were dealing with Ram, they're not going to do that now because of that backlash. But when we talk about Israeli society, let's not forget we're also talking about Arab Israeli society. Right. And part of what's happened is the debate there now, and it's far from being decided, the debate there, and it may not be going in such a good way because we're seeing, for now, the polling is that the turnout will be low, though these things can change very quickly. But the fact that this is now also part of the discourse within Arab Israeli communities, because until Mansour Abbas came along and changed Ram's policy and said quite publicly and clearly, I have my aim is to be part of a government, any government. He said he'll even sit with the far right. He just wants to be in the government because he thinks Arab Israelis need to be next to the table. And he kind of jettisoned. He didn't use, in the big speech he made after the election when Ram got in, he didn't mention the word Palestinian even once. He made a whole speech in Hebrew, a little bit of it in Arabic. Didn't say the word. He knew all I'm going to talk about is partnership as citizens, and that's just as important a debate as is happening in Jewish society. And we don't know where that's going to go. Hadash is in a very difficult position right now. They've got Balad on the one hand, the Arab nationalist space saying we'll never join any government, kind of pulling them one side. They've got Ram and other groups within Arab society, and it's not just political parties, because we see in the polls themselves, half of Arab Israelis are in favor. Sometimes it's fluctuating the whole time, but there certainly is a very large proportion of that community who do want to sit in governments. But until Mansour Abbas, the politicians kind of said it's never going to happen.
When the Arab parties joined together, was it the first election in 2019? There was a big spike in Arab...
No, the first time joint list was back in 2015.
Sorry, 2015. There was a big spike in Arab turnout, and it really seemed like this was maybe the dawn of a new era. It's now, again, Ram has broken off, and it seems like it's very iffy as to whether they're going to run together again and there's going to be lower turnout. Is this going to be a little bit cyclical, do you think, in Arab Israeli society? Is this going to be it's absurd to think that all the way from secular Hadashniks all the way to Arab nationalists in Balad would sit together, and Islamists would sit together in the one party. You would never imagine that in a
But they never did sit together in one party. And the problem with the joint list is that it kind of created an illusion of one party. It never was one party. And it's kind of like lots of nice Israeli left-wingers, I'm sure some of your friends in Tel Aviv, voted for them because they were the real left-wing option. Right. Let's not be naive. The joint list... Okay, was some communists, yes. So you could say they're on the left. It was included also Assadists, Arab nationalists, homophobe Islamists. Yeah. There was even a bigamist. I mean, it wasn't... Good measure. I mean, I would say to my left-wing friends who were voting, I said, you're voting for so many people whose views you abhor. But the reason the joint list even existed was originally Avigdor Lieberman, then on the far right... He was the one who was behind pushing the threshold up to 3.25% with the express intention of trying to force the Arab parties beneath the threshold. And therefore, all these small Arab parties, which perhaps on their own probably would not have crossed the threshold, need to join together. And that's why it's called the list. It's not called the joint party. It's not even called the Arab list. It's the joint list. And what we're seeing now is as I said before, the discourse now in Arab communities, and I'm not here to represent Palestinian Israelis, obviously, but the discourse there now is about what compromises and can we do to be part of a government, to be part of the collective responsibility. And I think what we're going to see is, it's easy to predict, but I think what's going to happen over time, maybe in another 2 or 3 election cycles, is that the divide between different Arab parties will be over that. The parties which can conceivably sit in a coalition and those who won't for nationalist ideological reasons.
So your mention of Avigdor Lieberman trying to pushing through that electoral reform to try and raise the minimum threshold of votes opens the door to ask you a question that we hear all the time, which is about electoral reforms more broadly in Israeli society, where people say the system, particularly in the last few years, the system is broken, it doesn't work, it feels unrepresentative, it feels like particularly small groups, particularly Haredi parties, have outsized influence because of the way they're able to use the system for their advantage. Do you see any possibility of any kind of electoral reform? Do you think there should be some kind of wider electoral reform? And what is even the smallest possible reform that you could imagine taking place in such a divided electorate?
So right now, the only reforms, and they're not necessarily good ones, are changes of the threshold up and down, and it's usually done because of some narrow interest, like we mentioned, Lieberman
include or exclude a particular.
Recently, they were talking about lowering it down because that would actually help the Haredi parties, who kind of split into two. Because those of us who know a bit about Yiddishkeit know the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, who are together in United Torah Judaism, aren't necessarily very good friends, even though perhaps to secular Jews and to other outsiders they look similar. And there are lots of reasons why different parties would want a slightly higher or a slightly lower threshold, and it would have an effect. But these are really, I wouldn't say it's cosmetic because it would have an effect, but this is not real reform. Now, the real reform obviously would make Knesset members more, like you said, more representative of communities, of voters. I think the Knesset should be much larger because 120 members of Knesset is a very small parliament by almost any. Very few countries, and Israel is no longer a small country. Israel's got a bigger population than all the Scandinavian countries, for example, nowadays. It's not no longer a tiny country. Yes, it's much smaller than China, but it's still almost 10 million. It's not a small country when it comes to population. 120 MKs when you're already 30 odd ministers and deputy ministers and committee chairs. It leaves very little, certainly a coalition MKs to actually do parliamentary work. The best thing in my, if it was up to me to decide how the Knesset would change, I would double the number of MKs and have have 120 voted in as they are today, and another 120 voted in some kind of local constituency basis, and that would sort of balance it. And it would also kind of mean that the Knesset would probably go from being a 13, 14, 15 party Knesset to a 7, 8 or 9 party Knesset. if they went if they took my way.
How would that happen? But what would the
we don't really have time to go into the nitty-gritty of it, but it works here in some ways. It works in New Zealand in a similar way. There are various ways of doing that, and I think what they did in New Zealand actually makes a lot of sense, unless only because I read up on it. I haven't read up on Australia enough yet, but it's not going to happen. I think for a good reason. The Knesset is actually representative because most of the communities, even the small like Bedouins or one certain flavor of Hasidic group, have their MK. Belz has an MK. Ger has an MK. Jerusalem, Lithuanian Mitnagdim have an MK. And Bnei Brak, Lithuanian have an MK. And Negev Bedouins have an MK. And Kibbutznikim have an MK. And this wasn't what it was supposed to be. The Israeli electoral system happened almost by mistake. It was one evening Ben-Gurion and the justice minister in the pre-state Minhelet Ha'am, which I'm not sure how to say it in English, but before the first election, they had to come up with a really quick and simple idea of how to have elections, and they thought the first Knesset would pass a constitution which would have a more well-thought-out system.
Constitution's due any day now, I think.
74 years, any day. So that's why they kind of agreed on it, and it's basically this, with except for the short not very successful experiment with direct election of PM that we had in the late 90s. That's been the system, and it hasn't worked that badly. Right. We talk 5 elections in 4 years. It looks terrible, but take off the last 4 years, the previous 70 years, 19 elections, which all except one in 84 delivered a clear-cut result. 84 they managed to cobble together a national unity government and split the term between Shamir and Peres. Not that bad. Right.
Doesn't necessarily need.
No, it needs tinkering with.
But not with the.
But because what I said before, because the fact that every community feels that they have something to lose, it would take a very serious process of consultation and really working out how best to do it. And that's not possible in today's political scene because it's all about yes, Bibi, no Bibi. Will it help Bibi? Won't it help Bibi? That's all people are going to care. We have to. The reform I think will come after Bibi's Mea Vesrim or whatever it is.
One of the things that we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years has been the rise of the parties that describing them as far right paints them as even somewhat moderate. These are Jewish supremacists, these are fascists, these are beyond what was once beyond the pale and is now very much in the mainstream. These are the Jewish supremacy, the Jewish power party led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, which has been, was at one point part of a system that was more or less unable to run because it contravened the laws of adhering to Israel's democratic values, but is now very much a mainstream part of the Israeli right. Can you chart their rise very quickly? What has been the main things that has contributed to what is they're now polling 8, 9, 10, 11 seats. This is a significant chunk of the population who are voting for fascists.
The rise has not yet happened in that sense because Jewish power has never run on its own in an election and crossed the threshold. Right. We're seeing polls now saying that if they were to run on their own, they would get 7, 8, 9, 10. I remember back in the mid to late 80s when Kahana, Meir Kahana, the founder of this movement, then called Kach, was his only term as a single Knesset member, back when the threshold was just 1%, and there were polls saying the same thing then. So there are periods when there is this unrest and people want to kind of kick the establishment in the arse and vote for the most extreme party, and that happens in many places. And you get these blips sometimes during election period. We had a blip like this back in 2019 when Moshe Feiglin, also a very far-right president, ran this kind of far-right libertarian party, and it was getting 7, 8 MKs in the polls, and then it didn't even cross the threshold. Yeah. So I'm not saying this is good. I'm not trying in any way to dismiss the Ben-Gvir phenomena. But yes, there is sadly more acceptance for that kind of message. It's not necessarily a new thing. The question is the issue of legitimacy. And what Ben-Gvir has done very well is Ben-Gvir himself was just 20 years ago the head of the youth department of Kach, which was then a prescribed terror organization, someone who couldn't even join the army because the Shin Bet has said basically this man must not be allowed to own a gun, and he was the most ostracized young man in Israel, and his elder colleagues were just the same. He's managed in the last few years to kind of worm his way into the establishment by kind of making himself a desirable interviewee. Right. He understood that the thing I need to do is I need to be an accepted person in television studios and on radio and so on. And he's kind of adopted this rather folksy, kind of challenging but jokey kind of persona. He's very eloquent, and he's good for rating. Right. And we see that we saw that with the rise of Trump.
Politicians who are good for ratings.
Yes, and left wing journalists need rating as well. Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the left. I think we'd be remiss as an NIF crowd to talk about those maybe to the left of centre, wherever that might be. Labor and Meretz were in the coalition for the first time in a very long time recently. Although actually Labor, I guess, was in the National Unity Government as well. How have they come out of this coalition? How are they being perceived? Merav Michaeli was re-elected as Labor leader, which I think is the first time in a decade that
much more than that. The last Labor leader to have 2 consecutive terms as Labor was Shimon Peres in the late 80s.
Yeah. Wow.
Rabin may have won a second term. He was murdered, but no one said. And Rabin's second term was Rabin's 2 terms were how much? 15 years apart. Right. So the last one to have at least 2. So
Merav has done that. Nitzan Horowitz is no longer the leader of Labour. Zahava Galon, who was leader in the mid 2010s, of Meretz, is now back in leadership. They seem to be in roughly the same position they were. Meretz is roughly at the threshold. Labour's maybe 1 or 2 seats above. I think people were hoping that there would be a resurgence of how great is it that they can be in power, let's come back to them. But instead, their vote seems to have been taken away even more by Yair Lapid largely.
Well, there's no vacuum in politics. And in a Knesset which is made just of 120 members, there's not that much space. I always argue that there isn't really an Israeli left because people always talk of Mapai and Labour having been the left. But they were centrist parties. They were essentially centrist parties, which were only left in the fact that back in the day they were socialists because they thought that collectivized economy, centralized economy, etc., is the best way to build a new state. But it never really was a left-wing party. It was always Israel's center party. And what happened over the years, and especially since the rise of Yair Lapid and Gantz now, is they've occupied the entire space which was Labour. Basically, Labour is now parked together with. It's like you have 2 car parks, and someone brings a massive, I don't know, lorry and a bus or whatever, and parks in your car park, and you've got your 2 cars have to somehow use the same space, and that's what's happened to Labour and Meretz. There is an Israeli centre which used to be Labour. Now the Israeli centre is. There are 2 parties, not small parties. Right. Yesh Atid and Benny Gantz is now, they're always changing their name, Mamlachti, National Unity, whatever, party. Together in the polls, they've got around 36. They're polling more than Likud. Yeah. This is Labour, or what Labour historically was. Not that long ago. Even Bougie, basically, in 2015, with 26 seats, got to get, and Lapid had another 12. So basically, this 30-odd bloc, which is as large as Likud, probably even larger than Likud. That's Labour.
That's the right.
And Labour is now basically parked on Meretz's green together. There's no room for both of them.
Now, should they run together?
I think that's the reality. Not because there is no difference between Labour and Meretz. There's very little difference now between them, but. The problem with Labour is it's an historic party which has done what very few parties have done in a democracy, assuming Israel's a democracy. It's a party which built a state. Right. I mean, it's an incredible achievement what the historic Labour movement did. But 10 years ago already, Amos Oz says Labour's historic role is over. But if you're the Labour leader, if you're Merav Michaeli or any other of the many Labour leaders we've had in recent years, you don't want to be the person to say, okay, I'm closing the lights in Israel's historic party. You know, it's not something that a politician is going to do. Say, I'm giving up on my party, and this is the party which built the state, but it's no longer relevant. Labour today is in Meretz's position because it's the party to the left of the Jewish Zionist whatever centre. It's the party of the Zionist left. There's no difference between them in their position. Yes, there's some difference in policy emphasis and in the people there, but they're in the same position. It's a very squash. But you know what? Together they got 13 seats. 13 seats last time. Right. That's better than Meretz did in its record in 1992. So actually, the Israeli centre left hasn't changed so much in the shape. The names have changed. Right. So Yesh Atid and Gantz, the Gantz whatever, is Labour. And Labour and Meretz is what Meretz used to be. So I totally understand the nostalgia and the political reasoning behind Merav Michaeli and her colleagues saying we have to run as Labour because we're Labour and one day we'll get back. I think that train has left. And sadly. Right.
Well, it's interesting to think about so much of the conversation that we have in the diaspora is about how our relationship with Israel, our Zionism, has changed when Jews were trying to establish a state, trying to make the state work, versus now as a very successful state. How should our relationship with these words and with these concepts change? And like you're saying, Labour has changed as well. The Israeli electorate has changed.
Well, I think in Melbourne you can really see it in the streets around us. You've got a street where you've got Meretz, a lovely building. You've got Habonim, their building. You've got all these organizations which don't really exist anymore as political entities are still here on the streets of Melbourne. I mean, this is my second visit to Melbourne, but it's like both times I've had this like incredible feeling of deja vu walking around Coalfield and like, ooh, they've still got this. Oh, it's interesting.
I think we're most proud of our Yiddish presence. That's
the one wonderful.
That is for sure. As people could have read recently in Haaretz.
But
as well.
do you know what the last election the Bund ever ran in?
Yeah.
Does anybody know? No, later than that. This is Melbourne. People are supposed to know about the Bund. The last election the Bund ran in was for the 5th Israeli Knesset.
Really?
And they didn't cross the threshold.
Right. Okay. Did they cross the threshold in the first?
They didn't run.
Oh, they didn't run.
They ran once. I think in the 50s. I think it was the 4th or the 5th Knesset in the 50s.
Amazing.
That was the Bund's last stand.
Amazing. We've got a question come in, and people who are here and certainly on YouTube can also feel free to ask. It's a question about whether actually Israel will be all that different depending on whether Netanyahu wins the election or Lapid wins the election, given that many within our broader camp perceive the last year or so as one of the most successful enablers of settlements and the persistence and expansion of the occupation that we've seen in a while. So I want to park that for a second and say first whether you think it is kind of 50-50 between the two. Is it pretty much just as likely?
It's very easy for me to say 50-50. That way I'm not committed
but
either way.
That's the kind. It's kind of borderline which way it's going to go.
When I look at the polls and I make the scenarios, it's about 50-50 because Bibi's doing well, but still not only about half the polls are giving him 61. Or even slightly less than half the polls. But if Meretz or Labour don't cross and so on, he'll probably get 61. Right. So next week until the lists are closed, Thursday at midnight next week, is going to be critical with Meretz. So those are scenarios. On the other hand, it's also very difficult to eject a sitting prime minister if you haven't got a stable majority, as Bibi himself wrote.
He just kept rolling on.
And then on the other hand, Benny Gantz has actually got more of a flexible kind of set of scenarios in which he sets a coalition. So I'd say it's like 50% Bibi, 25% Lapid, 25% Gantz. It's meaningless. I mean, sadly there's no political betting in Israel, so I can't go into a betting shop and say 5-1 on what's the recent line. But if I was, right, that's what I would.
So do you think that there is a substantive difference, particularly on issues concerning the occupation, which is something that certainly NIF people care a lot about and think a lot about in the way and the implications it has on Israeli democracy and Israeli society. how much is there going to be a difference, especially if a Lapid government is going to have to include not Kahanas fascists, but certainly staunch supporters of the settlement movement in order to succeed. So how much difference would there actually be between a Netanyahu and Lapid government?
Not that much, and as we've seen over
and why should we care then if it's the same?
Well, because that's not the only issue.
Right.
Not that much, and if you look at the last 54 years, the big changes have never been expected. You didn't expect Rabin to be the guy to go to Oslo. Rabin, who wasn't, said, I won't talk to the PLO. You didn't expect Arik Sharon to get out of Gaza. So this wasn't necessary to do with which prime minister was in power. Bibi, the first Israeli prime minister to officially say he's okay with two states. We obviously know that was millions of caveats. He never really meant it. And he's been rowing back ever since. Yeah. But all these things are not from the prime ministers you would expect it to come. And as we've seen with this government, which had merits and Ram and Labour, nothing happened. So no, it's not going to make a change to the Arab. Not going to make a direct change to the occupation. But when I say it's wrong to focus just on this issue, it's not because I don't think it's an important issue, and not because I think, okay, we can't do anything about it, so let's focus on rule of law, let's focus on state and religion, etc. I think that perhaps Israel needs to deal with other core issues to be able to get to the occupation. I think that we have a big issue now with Jewish fundamentalism in Israel, also in the diaspora, but in Israel, it's really there. And the question of the rule of law, the question of do we have a balance between judiciary and executive and so on. And these things need to be worked out, I think. Also those
questions seem just as insurmountable. Like, forever.
Yeah, but they're immediate. Those are burning issues right now. That will this next government be a government basically of right wing fundamentalists, or will there be a more quote liberal government? These are things that we're dealing with. Right, I'm not saying we're going to solve those things, and we're dealing with occupation right now. But the occupation isn't burning. The problem is we're not. I mean, it's also not necessarily a bad thing that we haven't got a high level of violence, but neither the Israelis and to a certain degree neither the Palestinians feeling a burning need to get to the solution right now.
We got a question come in online from Steve, who's asked about the role that individual personalities play in Israeli politics and as the leaders of parties. Yair Lapid is the best example, where he leads a party that basically he alone controls and decides. It's one of, if not the least democratic parties within the system, right? Unlike some of the other democratic parties, maybe it includes women, unlike the Haredi parties, but it's still very driven by personalities. Netanyahu has a lock on Likud that is partly a legacy of Likud being a very, as you spoke
and
about
yet
before,
he still has, but he also has a mandate from the biggest selectorate in the country.
Right. So how much is it that these personalities dictate Israeli politics, and how problematic is that? Is it bad that these are the people driving it?
There's nothing I'd love more than to have a technocratic government, like what they've had in Italy for the last couple of years, with Draghi coming over from the European Bank and taking over, and he's not any of the parties. Right. And so I spent a lot of time in Italy. So people are my Italian friends. I'm also half Italian, so my Italian friends are all very happy about. And nothing I'd love more than to have a group of anonymous grey bureaucrats take over. It would make my life. I mean. Sorry? In Australia, the equivalent is faceless.
The faceless men, right. They're the party apparatchiks, though, I think.
Faceless women is my ideal government. It's not going to happen. Government in many countries, in Israel especially, is very much personality-driven. Yes, we once had Levi Eshkol, who would have half tea, who was so colourless he would drink half tea off coffee. But... It wasn't. He was the one who kind of brought along the occupation.
Right.
He also won the 6-Day War. Yeah, there's two sides to that coin. But it's not going to happen.
Right.
And we talked a few minutes ago about how Labour has lost ground. It's not just because of Yair Lapid. It's because Labour failed to kind of articulate a new idea of what it means, and also merits to a certain degree. Yair Lapid. I spent many years writing a lot of nasty pieces about him and tweeting even nastier stuff. And all Israeli journalists kind of hate him because, Why is he?
Right, how come he got to be the guy?
Why not?
Right.
How is he? He's one of us. I mean, but Yair Lapid, but now I'm going to say some good things about Yair Lapid. He did articulate an idea. Now, it may be a bit of a hollow, shallow concept of a very center of center Israeliness, but it captivated me. In politics, you have to tell a story, and people then go and vote and say, I like your story, I'm going to give you a chance to represent me and perhaps be in office. He did that.
And unlike moderate party, centrist parties who came before him, including his father's party, he survived. He's now been around for longer.
And his father's party also had a compelling story. He said, we are the secular Israelis. We're the ones who work hard and pay taxes. And we're fed up with the Haredim, and we're going to fight the Haredim. That was a compelling story. And they did well for a couple of election cycles. But then they imploded it in fighting. So Yair Lapid learned the lesson. He needs a better story, because he wants to not just be the Chiloni, secular, anti-Haredi party, and he needs to make sure that after a couple of successful elections, people won't get too greedy, so he needs to kind of rotate around his people. He needs to control the show. And the great thing about Yair Lapid is that the team that ran his talk show are the team who are now running the party. Wow. They were the ones who made sure that the bookings every week, they would have like the right balance of, we used to call it in Israel, a transvestite, a rabbi, and I can't remember the third thing on every talk show. Right. So he makes sure that these people are still with him. They know what they're doing. They're professionals. Politics is a profession as well. People are here who do well in whatever their profession is because they're professionals. Right. Benny Gantz is still learning the ropes. Right. Bibi has forgotten already what Gantz has yet to learn. You need to run a party in a professional way. So yeah, it's not democratic. I have a difficulty, even though I think Lapid has proven himself in the last couple of years to be much more responsible and capable than we were giving him credit. I still have a problem voting for his party, also because I'm a bit more left-wing, but also because I don't like the fact, as you said, it's a non-democratic party. But it's hard to argue with success. Right. And it's hard to argue with the voters. The voters are voting for him, not for Labour and Meretz.
Right. Rick here has a question.
Thinking of possible swing parties, you haven't mentioned Shas.
What do you want to know about Shas?
In terms of potentially moving between blocks to, the run story, if you like.
Right, so Shas... Okay, so Shas is not
just going to be... Because the people on YouTube can't hear the question, in part repeat the question.
Why don't you repeat it and I'll answer.
So the question is about Shas maybe as a swing party, where in the olden days, not really that long ago, it used to be perceived that the Haredi parties could go with either side.
They were the kingmakers.
As long as they got what they wanted, they would leave the rest to the other parties to decide. Whereas more lately, they've been very much locked in with the Netanyahu camp. So how much is that? How much today are they?
So let's talk about both Haredi parties. Can either of them sort of start swinging again? Right. Are they going to go to the swingers party? Shas is locked in with Likud for a number of reasons. The main reason is that Shas's electorate is not so Haredi. Shas, maybe a third of their voters are Haredi Sephardi. The other 2/3 are Sephardi traditional. And they're basically Likudniks and Shasniks. Half of them are, so they can vote Shas if they know that Shas is going with Likud. And if Shas was to start swinging, it would lose at least half its vote. I don't see it happening. And also Aryeh Deri is sort of in the same boat with Bibi when it comes to being crooks. And so on, and therefore they need to subvert the legal system.
Not even alleged in Aryeh is very much convicted.
Twice convicted now, and and Bibi is indicted. As goes for UTJ, which is the joint list, the original joint list. I always say that the Haredim and the Arabs should run together because there was so much in common in Israel. UTJ, the party of Hasidim and Mitnagdim, or as we call them in Hebrew, Litaim, Lithuanians, there is a possibility that at least part of that party would swing towards a Gantz government, maybe even a Lapid government. It's still difficult to see that because even though their voters are not like the Shasniks, like half Likud, half Shas, they still many of the young generation become very right-wing. And that's a whole sociological and historic explanation how that's happened over the last 30, 40 years. So it's difficult, but I do see it happening there because it's not a centralized party. Shas is Arideri's party now. There's no one else in charge. Hasn't been for a long while. In UTJ, both because it's split between Hasidim and Menagdim, and because amongst those groups there are different rabbis and different Hasidic groups and different yeshivas, and each of them has kind of part of a little chunk of power. So I do see some kind of realignment there. Also because some of them are fed up with Netanyahu. Some of them just want to safeguard the interests of the Haredi community if there's another government in which Netanyahu is not the prime minister. So something could happen there. I'd say the chances aren't huge, but they're growing. And at some point, there will be a significant Haredi group which will say, we want to go back to that old position of being able to join any government and not just being in lockstep with the far right.
In the interest of time, we're going to do some quick fire questions. So first Rob, and then Janet, and then Ben.
I don't know if I've got a quick fire question for you, but there seems to be a very deep resignation from yourself and many people in Israel that there actually can't be constitutional reform. There can't be electoral reform that's meaningful. But without those preconditions being met, you have Knesset where 61 votes can basically change any law in the country and any rights in the country and any position of the country. And without overcoming that, you seem to imply before, yeah, it was pretty good for the last 60 years, only the last 5 years have been chaotic. What's going to change that chaos?
Well,
just to repeat the question for those at home, apologies, is that Rob's question is that without serious constitutional reform, which you seem largely resigned to assuming that it won't happen, how much will the ongoing crisis not change? But also this idea that 61 seats, the barest majority, can make significant change. The slimmest majority can make very significant social, political and legal change in the country, and then that will just keep rolling on, which is not positive.
I'll try and give a quick fire answer, though it's very difficult because there's a whole seminar to be had about that question. My accent probably gives me away. I come from two countries where there's no constitution. And yes, Britain is the mother of parliaments and so on, and Bajot's unwritten constitution, and it's worked so well. There's never been, since the Glorious Revolution, 350 or whatever years ago, there hasn't been a revolution in Britain. It's all been stable. It hasn't worked very well in the last few years. We've had Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament and almost trying to basically cancel democracy in the UK. And the Queen, bless her, was kind of like, what we're going to do. The whole systems need people making them work, and the Constitution is not going to be a safeguard. We've got another country where this Constitution is hewn in stone, and it allows people to go around with machine guns in schools. So I do want to have a constitution in Israel. I'm not waking up every morning and saying, God, we haven't got a constitution, what are we going to do? Israel's kind of done not too badly in the last 74 years without a constitution. It's not the main thing we need to solve in Israel. I'm not resigned, I have a sense of priority, and I don't think that's the biggest.
What is the top? What is the number one?
I think the number one problem now is to try and end Israeli polarization around fundamentalists against liberals. Not because it's a bigger issue than the occupation, which I think is the biggest issue. I think we need to do that first.
It's the enabler.
Religious, Jewish, nationalist, the mishmash. It's no longer just Haredim. It's a lot of things, and it's become a sort of kind of taken on sort of a zombie form of its own.
Someone should write a book about Jewish fundamentalism.
That's my next book.
What a good idea.
Thank you for that.
Janet, quick.
You haven't mentioned Lieberman, Victor Lieberman.
Actually, we have.
Very quickly, but we can talk more.
I'm interested, he's sworn that he'd never work with Netanyahu, but if the chips were down, do you think there could be Lieberman would rejoin a coalition?
No. The chips were
So
down.
the question was, is there any chance Lieberman would rejoin the coalition?
The chips were down many times in the last 3 years, and every time Lieberman has, for very personal reasons, not because he thinks that Netanyahu gave the police some kind of information about him and his family members and so on, has sworn to destroy Netanyahu. Not doing a bad job so far. He hasn't finished the job. Lieberman was the guy who would never sit with an Arab, and look what he's done that. It's very personal. I don't see him and Netanyahu burying the hatchet, but anything's possible in Israeli politics. But right now, it doesn't seem possible.
Ben.
You were speaking a bit earlier about merits and avodah and stuff, and around the world, there's been lots of prominent protest movements in recent years, I guess you could say. But that's not really translated into massive parliamentary shifts anywhere in Europe or America or Australia. Do you think, and that at the same time, there's sort of the demise of an old school proper left-wing parliament movements. Do you think the demise of merits and avodah is to do with that? Do you think it's to do with the demise of the kibbutz movement? What do you think something else is going on?
Well, every country has its own reason why the old left have sort of died out and why the new protest left has failed. I mean, the reason the new protest left hasn't become political was that Twitter doesn't vote. Actual old people who know the way to, even though they may be old, they know the way to the polling station. They're the ones who vote. Twitter doesn't vote.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
But every country has its own narrative, and you mentioned the death of the kibbutz movement. Look, the kibbutz movement was never a huge proportion of Israeli society, but it was a vanguard, and political and ideological vanguards change in every society, and we've seen that happening in Israel over the last few decades. You still can meet incredible people in kibbutzim who do incredible stuff in their daily lives and are very ideological, but they're no longer motivated in the same way. And there are other people who are leading ideological things. As I said before, the centre left in Israel hasn't really shrunk. It's more or less, if you bring in Lapid and the Gantz party and Meretz and Avodah in their shrunken state, you've got more or less Avodah and Meretz, Labour and Meretz at their peak in 92 or even before that. So what has changed is there is no narrative. There's no... Yair Lapid tells a very good centrist story, which is not left-wing. I think that you are seeing new people on the Israeli left, like Naaman Lazimi, who came out top in the Knesset to seat primary in Labour. If anybody doesn't know who Naaman Lazimi is, very worth getting to know her. Young Haifa councilwoman, only been a year in the Knesset, came out top in Labour primary. She tells a very good story about how Labour can be a new movement. I think she's too late for Labour, but I think the new Israeli left, when finally Labour and Meretz decide that there's no point in keeping these old brands apart, and she'll probably be one of the most interesting voices there. And she's a young Mizrahi woman, which gives her also some a different resonance. She's just one example. There are other people. I don't know who's going to be the person, but the question someone asked before you asked about personalities. Yeah, it's going to be personality driven. It's going to have to be someone. We hoped it would be Merav Michaeli. She didn't do that. She kind of brought Labour back from the dead, but she's probably not the right person, like a Tel Aviv media type, to do that. And Lapid's a Tel Aviv media type as well, but he's done a better job. And he wasn't, and Lapid could have joined any party he wanted. He decided to build a new brand because he understood I think quite correctly, that a new brand would be much more successful than overtaking Labour, which is what Merav Michaeli did. Merav Michaeli is saddled with a lot of history. Now, I think that history is going to, in the end, she'll fail because of that history. So whoever's going to come along to the new Israel, and there will be a new Israeli left party at some point. Hopefully, it'll have that kind of personality who can tell the story and sell them to the voters. And yes, it's the same problem with the old and new left in almost every country we're looking at nowadays.
Well, there is a little bit of hope there in terms of building at the grassroots. It's about people on the ground saying this is the kind of country. This is the bit where we plug NAF.
Exactly and say NAF is doing very important stuff.
You want to do this one? No. This is it. This is it, because this is how we make sure that no matter which government is in, no matter how much we wish that one party or another was higher or lower, it's important that someone is there not playing partisan politics, that there's someone not there solely focused on making sure.
But the gentleman at the back said something very important. He said they're doing very well as protest movements, and NF is doing well not as a protest movement, but as a grassroots
Civil society
incubator.
Yeah.
The real barrier is crossing over into actual electoral politics and having, and because that's, it's a shit system, elections, whether it's Israeli election or whatever country you want to look at. It's better than the alternative, and that barrier is still still has to be crossed. I'm not saying don't donate to NAF, donate to NAF. I'm just saying the fact that we have incredible civil society organizations which do incredible things is incredible, but
right, you need both.
It doesn't necessarily translate into seats in the Knesset, and that you need cynical, pragmatic, talented, professional politicians to do the job, and there are not that many of them. We think that we're too many politicians.
Well, so
there's
and yet you want to double them.
Look, no, I want to have more parliamentarians. I think parliament is something which is underrated. But now in Israel you've got two very professional politicians. One is Bibi. One is Yair Lapid. Is the first time Bibi's really met. First time in a long time. Back Sharon and Olmert and Barak for a short while could. Lapid is the kind of person who can counter Bibi. Labour Emirates haven't got that kind of a person, and I'm not even sure they can, because even if they had that person, maybe weighed down by all this dead weight of an old part of a legacy party.
Well, I'll tell you what, even if we do need both sides of that equation, what is definitely true is that the people in this room aren't voting in Israeli elections. Even those who are Israeli aren't going to be on the ground to vote. And so the most important thing is how we can contribute to the things we can contribute to. And that
subscribe to Haaretz.
Subscribe to Haaretz for sure. This is not the first time we're plugging Haaretz in the last couple of months, and it won't be the last. And certainly to keep supporting NIF and to be our partners in this very important work, to make sure that no matter who is in the next government, whether it's people who are generally our friends or generally not so much, that at least there are people.
The great
there.
thing about NIF is that they support so many organizations. Some of them you really make you mad, and some of them are great, and they all need to be there. and the incredible thing is that it's an organization which kind of ruins its own PR sometimes.
Right.
Because for all the right reasons, and that's why
to stand up for the important things.
And because I'm journalism is the one product, is an anti-product. Like if you make chocolate, you want the wrapping to be nice, you want it to taste good. Any product you make, it's supposed to be nice for the client. The only job in the world which you sell something that your client doesn't want and is going to hate is journalism. And it's kind of what NF is doing things similar, which is why I admire them so much.
Doing the things that need to be done.
Yeah.
Making sure that the people who need to do things have the resources they need. So with that, thank you so much, Anshel, for schlepping all the way out.
Always a pleasure. Have me again.
It was a pleasure.
I'll come again.
Thank you to our peers and our friends in Limudos for partnering to bring Anshel out as well. Thank you to everyone who's joined. We've had a lovely group online and also a smaller group here in person who have joined us. Thank you very much to our three other wonderful staff members, Eve, Max and Maddie. Our NIF team is growing, and we are well positioned to push forward a progressive conversation in the Jewish community well into the future. So thank you everyone for being our partners and our friends. For those of you who are online, as soon as we finish, there'll be a QR code which you can feel free to avail yourself of to make a contribution to the wonderful work that we're doing. Thank you everyone again, and we'll see you next time.